जो सफ़र हैगा सिर्फ सिख कम्युनिटी आप अपने आप च नहीं लड़ रही साडे बिहाफ ते कुछ इंडिविजुअल्स एलाइज बन के भी साडे लिए लड़ रहे हैं ते मैनू खुशी हो रही है कि अज शाम दे गेस्ट एक ਇਹੋ ਜਿਹੀ ਐਲਾਈ ਹੈਗੇ ਸਿੱਖ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਲਈ ਖਾਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਜਦੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਹਾਇਰ ਐਜੂਕੇਸ਼ਨ ਸਰਕਲਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ so it gives me great joy in welcoming our guest this evening. Please join me in welcoming Professor Joy Kanwar. First of all, Professor, it's so good to have you on the program. Sat Sri Akal, good evening. How's it going?
Oh, wonderful to be here, and thank you for everything you do for the community.
No, once again, the pleasure is all ours. We are so excited to talk to you. You are such an accomplished and notable figure in the Punjabi community, and we feel so lucky that because of this upcoming SALDEF Sikhs in storytelling event that is taking place this Saturday, May 11th, we get to talk to you a little bit and learn about not just your journey, but how you are an ally for this community, how you advocate through your own ways for the Sikh diaspora living abroad. Professor Kanwar, first of all, you know, it's so great to see members of our community, especially women, in higher positions in fields that kind of break out of your usual, doctor, engineer. Of course, law school is a track that is heavily advocated for by our parents, but often, that plays out in the more traditional sense. Someone is a practicing, lawyer or attorney or prosecutor, or maybe they go into politics, right? Higher education, especially at the level that you are, we don't see it so often, but perhaps it's just as, if not more important, to have representation in those circles as well. Professor Kanwar, I'd love to start the program tonight by learning a little bit about your journey. And if you could walk us through what you do. We know you're Dean of Inclusion and Diversity at Brooklyn Law School. You're Professor of Legal Writings, and you've researched and written about the Sikh experience as well. Please tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be on the program. So my background is that I was a corporate lawyer, actually, before coming into academia. So I graduated in 1999 with my JD. So I've had it for a long time. I have a master's in environmental law as well, which I got in 2000. And my dream was to be a public interest lawyer. And through happenstance, I ended up going to Skadden Arps, which is a large law firm. And actually, that experience led me to my first activism within our community, because I joined the firm in 2001. And what also happened in 2001, of course, was 9/11. So much of my early career was working with the Asian American community and the South Asian community. We restarted the South Asian Bar Association because of the rise in hate crimes against South Asian individuals, but in particular against members of the Sikh community. So we all looked around and said, what is it that we can do? And we began the South Asian Bar Association again after that point. And so my journey into academia didn't start until 2008. And I've been I'm a one school person. I've been at Brooklyn Law School, which has been the honor of my life. I cannot say enough about teaching law students. It is such an incredible pleasure. And it's especially important, I think, to have representation of all types in academia. And so I get a lot out of working with South Asian youth who come to law school and go on to do amazing things. So I've been teaching for 15 years, and this year I'm serving also in the administration as the Dean of Diversity and Inclusion. But my academic work has ranges, actually. I write a lot about inclusion in the profession. I write a lot about legal writing, which is what I teach day to day, and that is basically how to think like a lawyer. And then my most recent work since 2022 on has been about a very important Supreme Court case that turned 100 years old in 2023. So the case is United States versus Bhagat Singh Thind, and it is well known in the South Asian community, not so well known outside of our community. But it was basically the case in which at that time, South Asians were shut out of naturalization. So you couldn't become a citizen in this country. And so I got to know Dr. Thind's family and interviewed them. I talked a lot to them about what the legacy of the case means, what it means now. And I became interested in this because when I was a lawyer at my law firm, I also worked with the Sikh coalition to represent the victim of a hate crime in his civil case. And that was one of the most impactful experiences of my life, because we were, our client was the first person to bring a civil suit against his attackers. He had been attacked on the basis of his of his culture. And so one of the most important things was to be able to tell this story to my students. And this only came up because we, you know, years and years later, we saw other Asian American communities experiencing the same thing. And it felt like an old story. It felt like a very American story that needed to be told. So I started doing historical research. And I'm certainly not the first one. In fact, some of my co-panelists have worked on Dr. Thind's story as well through different media, like film or plays or whatever. But it's been so much fun to kind of see the angle we come at it from.
Once again, Professor Kanwar, you know, the rest of us, normal people who are not immersed in the world of law, we forget how deep the Sikh, the experience, the roots of Sikh history actually are in this country. You mentioned this case that turned 100 years old, Bhagat Singh Thind. You know, we think back, actually the Sikh experience starts even before that, over 100 years ago with the Gadri Babe. But, you know, as far as official records go, as far as the legal system goes in this country's law and order, we've been, you know, using that to our advantage, or at least advocating for ourselves for over 100 years now, like the Thind case shows. You know, and fast forward to today, it's kind of bittersweet, but it seems that we still have more advocating to do for this community. Professor Kanwar, you know, for folks who do deal, you know, with the corporate world or mainstream America, we've become very familiar with these words, diversity and inclusion, you know, as part of these initiatives that seem to be trickling down in all facets of the American way of life, especially in the workplace. What does it mean for a professor at Brooklyn Law School, especially one with your background, with your culture and heritage, to be the dean of inclusion and diversity? What does that look like on a day-to-day basis?
Well, one thing that is lucky about being at this school is that the history of the school itself, whether it's happenstance or by design, actually is about inclusion and diversity. And so the school will be 125 in a couple of years, but was one of the only schools to allow in women and people of color and immigrants back when it started. And so the entire history of the school is rooted in inclusion. And one of the things that makes the place so special is, and I hope I'm getting some of the, you know, folks who are watching to be interested in the school as well, or in law school in general. But it is very, very important that we remember that, because the law itself is not very diverse, and our laws are not always thinking about the best interests of all. And so it is really important to have a history that goes back, but more than that, to honor that history now, and to have as many folks from all different backgrounds knowing not only the law, but that law school itself is an option. But probably even more than attending law school or becoming a lawyer is just knowing your own history and the history of the laws of the United States. You don't need to be a lawyer to know those things. And that's been my passion project for the last couple of years, is to bring our stories, along with all of the other amazing stories that folks will hear on May 11th, to the fore.
I can't wait to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that you're personally going to share on Saturday at the SALDEF event. I have one more question for you before we go to break. Professor Kanwar, I love asking this to individuals who join us on the program that are well accomplished from our community, that are serving that purpose of representation. But sometimes it's important to take stock of how much work still needs to be done. Professor, how many folks look like you, South Asian women, in the circles that you normally traverse? And we understand that there is some advantages that you may have, because like you said, Brooklyn Law School in particular has been such an inclusive place and has a history of it. But generally speaking, when we look at higher education institutions, when we look at individuals that make it to the level of being a dean or a tenured professor, or someone who has a position of power and authority, how many faces do you see that are women, that are South Asian, brown individuals that have these histories that essentially set them apart from the rest of the room?
We have a lot of work to do still. So I feel like I know every single other Desi law professor in this country. We're all friends. And so, I think probably we could count on hands and fingers and toes how many of us are out there. But we are, wherever we are connected, and that's an important thing. So it's not just representation, it's knowing that your voice is in the room and that you have access. That is extremely important. That's what we try to teach our law students as well, is as long as you have the ability, be in the room. Be in the room and use your voice. We need our younger generation to be to know all of the history that we have been through and that our forebears have been through as well. It's critical. It's critical to know the story, because if you don't tell your story, someone else will, and that is something that I have seen happen many times.
And it's sad, but I do feel good that this is a recurring theme, that our community is becoming increasingly aware that even if it's one individual, even if it's one person, having that person in the room makes the biggest difference as far as we are concerned, and our community's best interests are concerned. Professor, we know you're the Dean of Inclusion and Diversity at Brooklyn Law School. You're a professor. You teach legal writing, which I loved how you put it, how to think like a lawyer, right? Yes. Professor, SALDEF, the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund, one of the premier civil rights organizations for Sikh Americans, is putting together this event. And I personally am so excited to hear what all of the different panelists are going to share. It's taking place this Saturday, May 11th in Manhattan, and we'll share all the information in a minute. But, coming back to your journey specifically and the things that you're passionate about, which you shared with us, right? You said something before the break, that it's so important to be able to tell your own story, because if you don't, someone else will tell it for you, right? You're an expert when it comes to the intersection of Sikh history and legal history in the United States. Where do you think this community has suffered, or Punjabi Americans have suffered in the past when our stories weren't adequately told by our community? Just from a historical perspective, if you could share something with us, or any instances that come to mind where Sikhs, Punjabis not having their own voice at the table has hurt them, maybe set their best interests back.
So this is very much a global story. So as we mentioned before the break, the Sikh community has been in America for a long time, over 100 years, and very much has been part of the fabric, certainly on the West Coast, but East Coast as well. But the important thing to remember is that it's not just an American story. The Sikh story goes up to Canada, crosses the river crosses the ocean to the Pacific, to Hong Kong, to Singapore, to Punjab, of course, but all parts of India. It's a global story. And one feature that I think is really, really important is that the passion and importance of the community knowing its history has come to bear in many circumstances. So I talked about the United States versus Bhagat Singh Tind case, which was the case about naturalization. So all South Asians were impacted by that. But if you go just a little bit further north into Canada, there is the famous story of the Komagata Maru, which came across the ocean to Vancouver and was never allowed to dock. And ended up being such a tragic story because of the number of people who lost their lives. And the government of Canada, 100 years after that incident in 2014, actually apologized.
Wow.
Justin Trudeau apologized, and that was because the families never forgot and just kept bringing the story to the table and saying, imagine what would have happened had you let these folks become part of your society. Imagine what would have happened. And so this story is not centuries old. This story is now, as you may have seen in the news. There are still situations in which advocacy for the Sikh community puts people's lives in danger. So most famously in Canada, in the Vancouver region, where an activist was killed there, and there are all kinds of complicated situations going on there. But the Indian government has its role in this story as well. And so it's really important that we know these stories, because then they're not one-offs. They're sort of like a consistent sort of othering that happens, that can happen. And then there are beautiful stories of inclusion as well, of being part of the societies in which the Sikh community thrives. So that is true in India, that is true in Canada, that is true in the United States. So those are the beautiful stories. So it's not only one kind of turn of story, but it is important to remember that these things are cyclical in a way, and there's a lot of power in telling our next generation these stories as well. It gives them so much more ability to understand circumstances, rather than thinking, oh, well, where did this come from? And also actually understanding that these struggles can be within our communities, but in other communities as well. So it's an important thing to have that empathy.
Professor Kanwar, you articulated such an important point here that, one of the hallmarks of our community's progress in not just achieving social and civil justice for the diaspora, but also actually becoming, more ingrained in their local communities, their new homes, has been the ability to preserve history for better or for worse, right? When we look at the next generation, this is so important. I mean, there are these amazing initiatives like SALDEF's event this weekend, obviously, but I'd love a quick comment from you on the responsibility that families, right, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles bear to relay some of these experiences to their children, to the young kids in their family, in their communities. So these stories aren't just something you come across a social media post. They're not just something you see on TV. You heard about this event and you caught a clip on TV like someone might do right now, right? But it's something that is a conversation that takes place in the living room, at the dining table, in a comfortable, candid setting where these children understand that it's more than just a social media post or a day that we remember once a year, that this is fundamental for us to move forward as a community.
First of all, I am so glad you asked that question. I was hoping that you would, because this is basically my call to action, which is that if there are folks who are watching this program and you have young people in your lives, so whether they are your grandchildren or your children or nieces or nephews or whomever, I can't tell you how important it is for those young people to hear the stories from you. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that you have a history PhD. You don't need to. Right. You just need to tell folks what you've been through, and the unbelievable stories that come out of the generations before us are, I mean, it can't even be described. What it takes to immigrate to a different place is like, those are some of the greatest stories of all time. The hero's journey is a classical trope, and it's basically, many times it is someone who is going from crossing oceans to be somewhere else. Those stories are really powerful. Your own history is really powerful, and just educating your young folks as to the things you've seen and gone through cannot be underestimated. Yeah. So my call to action would basically be to sit down in whatever fora you'd like, over the dinner table or on a walk, and talk to your young folks about your stories, and you won't believe how much they have been wanting to hear them.
I'm so glad that we heard it from you. I'm going to repeat this for the benefit of our viewers. ਸਾਡੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਦਰਸ਼ਕਾਂ ਲਈ ਇੱਕ ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਨਾ ਕਾਲ ਟੂ ਐਕਸ਼ਨ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਲਈ ਹੋਮਵਰਕ ਹੈਗਾ ਕਿ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਨਾਲ, ਜੋ ਵੀ ਨੌਜਵਾਨ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਆਲੇ ਦੁਆਲੇ ਹਨ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਬਹਿ ਕੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਐਕਸਪੀਰੀਐਂਸਿਸ ਬਾਰੇ, ਆਪਣੇ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਗੱਲ ਕਰੋ। ਸਿਰਫ ਸਾਡੇ ਗੁਰੂਆਂ ਦਾ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਨਹੀਂ, ਬਟ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਆਪਣਾ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ, ਕੀ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਸਫ਼ਰ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ, ਬਿਕੋਜ਼ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਕਿੰਨੇ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਟ ਲਾਈਫ ਲੈਸਨਸ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਗਾਂ ਭਵਿੱਖ ਲਈ ਅਸੀਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਦੇ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ। Professor Kanwar, so without further ado, I want to talk about this event. Calvin, if we could show the flyer up on the screen. It's taking place this Saturday, May 11th in New York City. You are one of the esteemed panelists. And if we look further down, we can see all of the participating speakers in this event. But Professor Kanwar, first of all, how excited are you to be part of this? And without giving too much away, can you share some light, can you share some information about what you're going to be talking about come Saturday?
Definitely. So first of all, I'm absolutely thrilled to be part of this. When I got the email about it, I almost jumped out of my seat. I was so excited. So the main thing that I'm excited about is actually to be in the room with all the other folks. So we have journalists from CNN, we have poets, we have filmmakers, we have social media influencers, and we have even viral storytellers in our community on that day. And part of what we are doing is telling stories from every different perspective. All the panels are going to be amazing. I think our panel ends the night, which is about storytelling for change. So among our our folks are Nav the poet, who you had on here before, but Harjit Singh, Nardeep Kurmi, Anupreet Kaur Ramsey. These are all folks who are top of their fields and are like absolutely amazing storytellers. But our lens is about storytelling for change. So that has a little bit of the kind of the aspect of what I was talking about, which is making sure our communities and our young people know that things can change and that we have been part of the change in all of the things that we've done, even starting 100 years ago. And knowing all of that is part of the fabric of what we're talking about. But I am going to be there all day. It starts at 3. It ends at I think a little after 8, but I heard there are going to be pakoras. I heard there are snacks. I heard that the seating is great. So there are all kinds of things that are going to be wonderful, but I'll be there right at the beginning because we have music, we have spoken word, we have, short films, all kinds of things going on that day. And I really want to thank SALDEF for putting this together. They're the oldest Sikh civil rights organization in the country, and to have the vision to even go outside of just the law and those stories and bring together diasporic talent is amazing. So I can't wait.
I couldn't agree with you more to highlight the fact that achievements amongst Sikh and Punjabi Americans go beyond just the entrepreneurs, the doctors, the science-heavy fields, but they go into the arts, they go into law and education. It is truly a one-of-a-kind event. ਇੱਕ ਵਾਰੀ ਫਿਰ ਦਰਸ਼ਕਾਂ ਲਈ ਮਈ 11 ਤਰੀਕ ਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਸੈਟਰਡੇ ਇਹ ਇਵੈਂਟ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ ਮੈਨਹੈਟਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ. You can still get tickets ਦਾ ਲਿੰਕ ਸਕਰੀਨ ਤੇ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਹੋਇਆ ਹੈ. ਅਗਰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਲੋਕਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈਗੇ, if you're not local and ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਵੈਂਟ ਅਟੈਂਡ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਹੋ, you can always sign up and there will be a broadcast of the event. But the important thing is go to the SALDEF website for all of the information. Professor Kanwar, one last question, because you did say that, storytelling for change is something that you'll particularly be focusing on. Young people, I mean, I sometimes feel it myself. I work in news, so obviously sometimes, we're overcome with this sense of despondency, right? What does the future hold, especially going through times like this of turmoil that, for a lot of the younger generations, maybe the first time they're seeing this kind of these kind of atrocities play out in real time, whether you look at the Middle East, whether you look at what's happening in Ukraine, but specifically the ongoing conflict in Gaza has, propelled this movement amongst young people. And without getting into too much detail, do you have something that you can say to those folks that are maybe in high school or college, university, that are feeling so strongly about this right now and maybe encountering a pushback, not just from within the school system, but from lawmakers, from, the talking heads on TV, right? What do you have to say to students today as a professor about their efficacy to bring about change through means of protest or raising their voice or activism?
So you had asked a question about despondency and despair, and I think that there are often, especially in times like now, and even in former times, that is the overwhelming emotion, which is that there is nothing that can be done or nothing will ever be right. But I would say to hold on to hope, because if we learn anything from our stories, it is that things can change. And so there is a great deal of sadness right now, but I think that there is also cause for hope. And if anyone is going to solve these issues, it will be our young people.